Good afternoon. My name is Patrick Byrne. The people who recognize me are identifying themselves as old-timers in the trade, because I've been kind of on the down low for a few years. Why, thank you, because this is a rare appearance. It's been 2 years since I've appeared at anything Bitcoin. And what a great time to be speaking with people on a stage, the end of fiat stage, at a Bitcoin conference, just, 8 weeks after the Federal Reserve suspended reporting the money supply, M2, on a weekly basis. Do you know that? When I first got to college in the early 80s, the first thing in economics, they talked about M1 and M2 and the weekly. The whole world waited for the weekly money supply to be announced, or bi-weekly. They suspended it a couple months ago. They're not reporting it anymore. And that's because our M2 is going parabolic. The wheels are coming off the financial system. Does anyone remember about 9, maybe 8 months ago, there's a very key facility called the repo facility. It's an overnight facility that basically, if banks end up really stressed out or with some mismatch in their book, on that night they can borrow what they need to from the government. There was all this concern back in the fall when it spiked to $90 billion one night in an overnight repo. Huge spike. Even banks try to stay away from this facility because it indicates weakness. It spiked to $90 billion overnight. I think it was November, and that was such. Anyone know where it's now stabilized? Anyone know where it is stabilized? 500 billion. So we're now 500 billion, where 8 months ago, 90 billion was this thing that was making financial news. So the wheels are coming off the system. And the question is, what's the system that's going to replace it? My role for the young timers here, for the later adopters, I see myself as something of in West Africa, there's a position in the tribes called a giro, and that's the old man of the tribe who remembers the tribe lore, and he sits around the campfire and he explains to the youngins so they don't forget what the tribe is about. I think that somewhere evolved into my role. In 2013, the largest company in the world dealing in Bitcoin was a diner in Western Australia of $800,000 a year in annual turnover. And the Bitcoin community was getting excited about the day that they would have $1 million business accept Bitcoin. And how many years before a $10 million business? And how many years before a $100 million business? And how many before a $1 billion business took it? Maybe in 5 or 6 years. Well, I founded and was running a company called Overstock.com. And on January 1st, 2014, we started taking Bitcoin at $1.4 billion. So we for the old timers used to tell us we sort of saved 5 or 6 years of adoption. People forget this. The largest business in the world taking Bitcoin was an $800,000 a year diner in Australia, and a company of $1.4 billion took it. And that was January 1st, 20. So that was me. And I got invited. Thank you. I got invited to speak, to be the opening keynote of the world's first global conference on Bitcoin. It was in Amsterdam. And it was really nice. It was the first global conference. Thousands of people showed up, criminals and feds and spooks and every kind of person you could imagine. Everyone, it was the first time something like this ever happened in the world. I gave a talk. I guess people, I don't know what they were going to thought I was going to talk about. I gave a talk on the history. So I had cancer in my 20s, and I kind of was an invalid through my 20s. So I couldn't really do much. So I did a PhD in philosophy, in political philosophy, and the history of really the intellectual origins of the US Constitution. And I explained, in fact, the philosophy. This is a divisive word. I know I don't want to be divisive. The correct word is liberalism. There's a political philosophy called liberalism, political liberalism. It has its roots in the ancient Hebrews and the Athenians and the Romans and the English and the Dutch, and it reaches its apotheosis in the US Constitution. And I saw at the time Bitcoin as the fulfillment, actually blockchain, as the fulfillment, as the completion of that tradition. And here's why. And I'm saving you an hour. It was an hour of riveting philosophy I delivered in Amsterdam, I can promise you. But it used to be the case that anyone I met in this movement, in 2014, 2015, everyone had seen this video. It was like the standard video for newcomers. And I explained this, I gave sort of a 1 hour or 45-minute compressed explanation of the political philosophy that reaches its culmination in Bitcoin. And boy, was it riveting as philosophy goes. But here's the main event. The weakness, the Achilles heel of our tradition was understood by our founding fathers. It was corruption. And it's because if you have a society of institutions and not men, then you're only as good as your institutions. And when they get corrupt, you kind of get the worst of both worlds. And our founding fathers in Federalist Number 10, Madison, there's this beautiful passage where he talked about how in designing, I can't do it in the 19th century language, but it was along the lines of, in designing this Constitution, we looked at all the previous attempts at democracies, ancient and modern, and look at what made them implode, and we designed this Constitution to address those problems. Unfortunately, there's one problem we didn't figure out how to solve, and it's the biggest problem of all in all the history of democracies. And it's the problem of what they called factions, what we would call special interests. But I would even go further, and the real thing, the problem with special interests is the corruption, is the capture. And anyone who's kind of followed my career for 15 or 16 years, I was kind of a one-man Occupy Wall Street starting in 2005. I figured out a bunch of the stuff that was going on Wall Street, and I took it. I mean, I don't want to claim much credit. I was asked to participate. I had various conversations around Greenwich, Connecticut with hedge fund bosses after they had gotten to know me, which probably doesn't speak well of me. Various conversations of the form, I was a CEO of a public company. And as I would get to know these hedge fund guys, I'd have various conversations of the form, gee, kid, we can make a lot of money together if you want to play ball. And there's a lot of ways the CEO of a public company can help hedge funds make money and get a cut. And so I mapped it out, and I took it to all the parts of Washington, D.C. you would think would care. And it was just like, people may remember that before Bernie Madoff went down, there was a guy named Harry Markopolos who figured out Bernie's grift. And 6 years in a row, he went to the SEC and explained to them exactly what Bernie Madoff was doing. They just shut the doors. Well, I had that same experience all through Washington. And I just became aware that Washington, D.C. is completely captured, almost completely captured by powerful interests. It's really a Marxist idea that behind the scenes, we think we're living under a rule of law, neutral rule of law, but behind the scenes, powerful players have their hands on the controls and really dictate outcomes. Well, when I started saying that about Wall Street in 2005, and that the SEC was not only not really protecting us from Wall Street, it seemed to be in bed with Wall Street in some way. The press used to run photos of me with UFOs coming out of my head to suggest, it was a conspiracy theory to suggest the SEC is inappropriately close to Wall Street. So the central problem of our tradition is capture. And I don't think it's just, a guy won a Nobel Prize for figuring this out in 1971, Stigler. A paper called A Theory of Regulatory Capture. And its argument was society creates these regulators to protect us from certain industries. And we don't understand how those industries capture the regulator and turn them back against society. So I saw blockchain as the perfection of our liberal tradition. By the way, liberal, we don't say liberal anymore, because 90 years ago, the left took the word socialism. You couldn't say socialist anymore after the USSR, so they started calling it liberalism. By liberalism, I mean what people now say classical liberalism or libertarianism. I saw Bitcoin and blockchain as the fulfillment of that, because I thought what we were going to be doing as a community was building what in computer language they would call a warm standby, an alternative system that we could get built as long as the current system all held together, and we would get this blockchain-based systems built and starting to supplant the conventional systems. And the areas I chose to work in, I called the tech stack for humanity. I said, what is the future going to look like? What is the most fundamental processes of civilization we're going to need in blockchain? And I figured they were identity, land governance, because that's where capital really comes from, central banking, capital markets, supply chain, and voting. And that's the basic tech stack. And so 7 years ago, I went around either founding companies or investing in startups that were doing those things. I am afraid that that strategy may not work out. I think we're coming up a little bit short. I think we need about 5 more years. We're really just getting our systems in as a community, our systems into production, our systems able. We need 5 more years, and I'm afraid the wheels are coming off the current system before the standby. We're not ready to do a hot swap into a blockchain-based world. Sadly. So that's my, and on money. So one of those companies, the one I'm really proud of, there's a guy, Simon, anyway, Gabriel of Bed. I learned about, it was a really fun period of my life, because I knew those 6 companies I wanted to own a piece of. That's the fundamental of the future. And I would do research, and where there was not a company in existence, I would form one and capitalize it and write a term paper and find the right people to work in it and get them going. And by the way, I left all of this behind 2 years ago. I have no monetary interest in any of these companies for other reasons that people may have followed in the news. I kind of disappeared to Indonesia and laid low. Well, and where I wish I still were some days. The issue that one of my favorite of those companies, there was one we didn't have to start because I found somebody had the idea. There were some folks down in Barbados. They had a company called Bit, and it was basically 6 guys living in a team house doing extreme programming, and they were trying to build a digital central bank. And a blockchain-based central bank, and they've gotten something live. There are things live in the Caribbean, and Bit has gone on. I know the issue of central bank digital currency is now a really big topic. That makes me happy, but I want to tell you a story about that I think you can use as a microcosm of what's going on in America. And to introduce this last story, before maybe we'll go to some questions, I want to tell you that those of us who are old enough to remember the late 80s, there was a big financial collapse here called the S&L crisis. And the US did something pretty interesting, and it was probably the last great bipartisan act I can ever remember. A Democratic Congress and a George Bush I worked together. They created a law that basically used the power of eminent domain to step in and said, to fix this financial crisis, we're gonna rip up these banks. We're gonna do all kinds of things the government's never done, and we're gonna cram it down the throats of people. And the fact that we got into that crisis because every banker in the world at the time had senators on speed dial. There was this famous guy named Charles Keating, this big Arizona, and he had 5 senators on speed dial. One of them named John McCain. They were the Keating 5. And he could call anytime the regulators showed up. He could call his senators, and the senators would get regulators off his back. That was going on all over the country. And when they did this act, the Congress and the president got together and they created a steamroller, and they steamrolled over the industry, and they fixed everything. And we got 25, 30 years, well, 20 years of growth. The Japanese, on the other hand, had a problem. The Japanese were more corrupt. And in their parliament, which is called the Diet, and it's got a huge number of people, half of them are owned by various, and I don't mean no disrespect to Japanese or anywhere, I'll be talking about my own country in the same way shortly. They were too corrupt. And if they went in and did the kinds of things they did in the United States, it would have bankrupted this insurance company, and it would have bankrupted that bank, and it would have, well, each of those insurance companies had their regulators that they their members of the parliament they called up, and the parliament stayed lock-jammed, and they did nothing. And as a result, for 30 years, Japan has lived under the weight of a zombie financial system. And it's because the elites of Japan could not be defeated. They couldn't do what they did in this country and crunch up that system, part of the financial system, so things could start moving again. And so for 30 years, Japan has labored under that mistake. After a decade of it, they started referring to the lost decade of Japan. That was in 2000. They're now 30 years into their lost decade. And it all really comes back to the fact that they could not deal with their corruption. To do the things they needed to do, they had to do things that would have hurt private interests, and those private interests were able to block the whole process. And that's why we had 30 years that the Japanese didn't. I think I can tell you, we've reached the same place in our society in terms of decadence and corruption. 7 years ago, in China, they really had not woken up like we had to the potential here, like the US had. And I had opportunities, a number of people there did, of explaining in various formats to Uncle Sam the power of this technology and how it was going to change the world and how we had to get this built. And the problem was that in building a new blockchain-based set of systems, it's going to hurt some powerful people in the United States, some powerful entrenched interests. And if Uncle Sam, if you let those people call up their senators and stop this, we're going to fall behind, and China is going to get this prize. And I know those conversations very explicitly like that were held repeatedly. China, 2 years ago when I sort of checked out of the scene, Xi Jinping had come out publicly, 3 or 4 years ago, they named blockchain one of the 5 technologies they want to dominate by 2025. About a year later, the president of China came out and said, I now understand why this is the most important of those 5. And then about a year and a half ago, he came out and said, I now see blockchain as the most important technology of the 21st century. And because of that, China has done beautiful work in blockchain. On our side, I can tell you everything I feared was going to happen has happened. Wall Street has done everything they can to prevent blockchain-based settlement and I know it's leaking. Could have all been done 6 years ago. It's leaking into the world. Central bank digital currencies. We had stuff built 5 years ago. China has now been experimenting for about 18 months, and they're doing wonderful things. They're doing this very interesting thing where they're issuing money. It's helicopter money, but it decays. So you have like 60 days to spend it. So I just want to point out, in economics, there's a principle called the Cantillion Principle. If you think of the economy as a central bank with a bunch of rings around it, concentrically, different layers of the economy, the Cantillion Principle is that when you inflate the economy by pumping money into the central bank, the people who get the benefit are the ones directly wired into the central bank. In our case, the great big Wall Street banks. And then the next ring is the top 5. Then the next ring is the other New York banks, then the regionals, and at the very edge is the consumer. So by its nature, what we've been doing for 13 years, trying to prop up the economy with free money, is really been a huge wealth transfer to the elites. A way, instead of distributing helicopter money that actually gets in the hands of people and they have to spend in 30 days, is if you're going to do helicopter money, seems like a far preferable way to do it. Anyway, my point is all of this really was built 4 or 5 years ago in the West. All of it was ready to go into implementation. All of it got stopped by governments. And our progress has been impeded by our governments, and in particular the United States government. And meanwhile, China, their president got it. And they're building out everything we're building. So I think that I compare that to what took down Japan. At the end of the day, it was the corruption of Japan and prevented their government from fixing their financial system, and they've lost 30 years. And I think the same thing is going on here. However, it's going to come out of their hands. And I think I hear rumblings that they're more than rumblings. People I know who are interacting with the government, and I do not interact with government under any conditions at all these days. Yeah. I highly suspect you're going to see me get arrested or blown up or something. You'll know what I mean. Sure enough. But the people who are interacting with government that I talk to are telling me people there are of a mindset that says this has already gotten way out of hand and it's time to claw it back. They want to claw back stuff, permissions that the office of the controller gave 3 years ago. They want to start clawing things back. I think it's going to come out of their hands. I think the wheels are falling off their system. And I don't celebrate that because I think it's going to create a lot of human carnage. I just want us to understand out of the rubble, there's going to be a question of what world do we build? Do we build the authoritarian world that they want, or do we build a world based on blockchain, which incorporates certain cypherpunk values about freedom and individual autonomy? And that big decision is going to be coming to us. And in a way, I don't think the current folks in power are going to be in a position to stop. So with that said, I've got time for 1 or 2 questions. Sir. Good question. Most important aspect of anti-elitism, it may well be getting a form of money in which we can communicate without going through them. Here's the economic theory. What money is, it's described a bunch of different ways, but it's a medium through which we communicate prices. We can price things. Well, what is a price? A price is a combination of 2 pieces of information: value and scarcity. So we humans want to communicate to each other all kinds of information about value and scarcity. In a market, plays a coordinating function and gets the right people supplying to the people who want the value, and so on and so forth. So value and scarcity get conveyed in a price. They want to control the medium through which we send that information so they can distort it. They can distort it and get us to do things we wouldn't do otherwise. They want to distort that. And they view themselves like some workmen up in front of a grand machine with a screwdriver, and they think they can fine-tune it and get us all to behave correctly. That's why we need a form of money that no government mandarin can just invent, like gold, or how about a gold that you can flash across the universe, Bitcoin. No government mandarin can sign a piece of paper and create a room of Bitcoin or gold like they can with dollars. That's why we need a money supply. As this all collapses, they're going to try to introduce a new fiat, probably based on the IMF special drawing right. I want to see when it all collapses, a new financial system gets introduced without a central banker behind it who thinks he can fine-tune it. And the perfect one for a modern economy would be not to function maybe as the day-to-day currency, but as of course Bitcoin. It's the most hacked at secure. It's like gold, only, and has all these properties of gold, only it's electronic. And I want to see international financial system rebuilt on blockchain, Bitcoin, or rather than us reinvent another system based on, in this case, the IMF's central bank. So I'll stop there. I'm a minute over.
Okay, we had 2 years ago, the World Bank had its meeting of all the countries of the world in the United States, and they all voted to switch the systems to gold-backed currencies. And the United States even printed it up. Ronald Reagan printed it up in Texas, and it went to Switzerland in the bank, and they won't release it. So they're trying to hold it back. But they're standing by to do a gold-based currency all over the world. Every country in the world voted for it for the World Bank meeting a couple of years ago.
You know, at this point, it could be gold-based or Bitcoin-based. Bitcoin has the properties that make gold work. And the most important property is you don't want some government official. Right now, a government official can sign a piece of paper and create new dollars. 40% of all dollars in existence, I'm talking electronic, not paper, 40% was created since last summer. 40% of all the dollars in the world were created since last summer. We need a way to communicate to each other in a medium that government can't manipulate. It's been an honor to be back and to see you all again.